Princess Zarya of the Crystalline Empire had never known fear. Born into a civilization that had mastered interstellar travel millennia ago, she'd faced down plasma storms and negotiated with beings of pure energy. Her people, the Lumini, were renowned across 3 galaxies for their technological superiority and unwavering composure. Zarya's crystalline skin refracted starlight into rainbow patterns as she stood at the helm of her diplomatic vessel. Earth was supposed to be a routine mission, just another primitive world to guide toward galactic civilization. The humans had barely reached their moon after all. What could they possibly teach her? Then she met Dr. Sarah Chen. The human scientist wasn't impressed by Zarya's crystalline technology or her royal lineage. Instead, Sarah asked questions no one had dared to ask in 1,000 years. Why did the Lumini choose to evolve their bodies into living crystal? What had they lost in the process? Could a civilization that had eliminated all vulnerability truly understand the rest of the galaxy? Zarya found herself stammering for the first time in her 300-year life. The familiar certainty that had guided her through countless diplomatic missions cracked like thin ice beneath her feet. Sarah's questions pierced through layers of crystalline pride that Zarya hadn't even known she possessed. "Your people are beautiful," Sarah had said one evening as they watched the sunset from her laboratory's roof. "But beauty isn't the same as perfection. Sometimes our flaws make us who we are." Zarya's hand had trembled then, actually trembled, as she reached up to touch her own face. The perfect crystalline structure that had always been her. Pride now felt like a prison. For the first time, she wondered about the soft-bodied ancestors her people had evolved from, about the messiness of organic life they'd so proudly left behind. The diplomatic mission stretched from weeks into months as Zarya found herself drawn back to Sarah's lab again and again. Each visit stripped away another layer of her certainty. Each conversation revealed new depths of human resilience, not despite their imperfections, but because of them. When the order came from the Crystalline Empire to conclude the mission, Zarya faced her first true moment of fear. Not of danger or death, those were simple calculations of probability, but of loss, of returning to a world where everything was perfect and nothing ever changed. She stood in Sarah's lab one last time, her crystalline form catching the morning light. "I don't know how to be anything but what I am," she whispered. Sarah smiled that infuriating, wonderful human smile. "That's the most honest thing you've said since we met. Maybe it's a start." Zarya left Earth carrying something dangerous within her perfect crystalline form, doubt. And perhaps, though she would never admit it to the High Council, something even more dangerous, hope. As her ship broke through Earth's atmosphere, she realized that the Lumini's next great evolution might not be toward further perfection, but back toward the beautiful uncertainty of being alive. And for the first time in her long life, Princess Zarya was afraid. Afraid and absolutely exhilarated. The High Council chamber of the Crystalline Empire was designed to amplify perfection. 12 crystalline beings sat in geometric precision, their forms refracting light in calculated patterns that spoke of order and control. Zarya stood before them, her mission report due, and for the first time in her diplomatic career, she hesitated. "The humans are unique," she began, watching the subtle shifts in the council members' crystalline faces. "Their technological development is erratic, their social structures seemingly chaotic, but they have affected you," interrupted Council Member Vexthor, his voice sharp as cut diamond. "We see the fracture patterns in your crystalline matrix. They're microscopic, but present. You're experiencing emotional instability." Zarya's hand unconsciously moved to her chest, where indeed the tiniest of cracks had begun to form. In the past, such imperfections would have been immediately corrected through the Empire's regeneration chambers. Now she found herself strangely reluctant to part with them. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "these fractures are not a flaw, but an adaptation." The chamber erupted in harmonics of disapproval. Councilmember Syrath rose, her perfect form towering over the others. "You suggest we embrace imperfection? This is worse than we feared. The human contamination must be contained." But Zarya wasn't finished. Sarah's words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes our flaws make us who we are." The humans have achieved something we lost centuries ago, she continued, her voice growing stronger. They've maintained their capacity for growth through imperfection. Their art, their music, their very civilization is built on the beauty of uncertainty. Enough! Vexthor's voice shattered the perfect acoustics of the chamber. Princess Zarya, you will submit to immediate crystalline regeneration. The human influence must be purged. Zarya straightened, feeling the fractures in her form multiply with each beat of her crystalline core. No. The single word hung in the air like a crack in reality itself. In 3,000 years of council history, no one had ever refused regeneration. The humans have a saying, she continued, watching as tiny fractures began appearing in the chamber's walls, spreading from her words like ripples in a pond. They say that broken things can be more beautiful than perfect ones. They call it kintsugi, the art of embracing damage and repair as part of an object's history. She took a step forward, and the fractures in her form caught the light, creating patterns more complex and beautiful than any perfect crystal could achieve. I move that we send a full diplomatic delegation to Earth, not to guide them but to learn from them, to remember what we forgot when we chose perfection over growth. The council chamber erupted in chaos, a sight unseen since the Empire's founding. As Zarya watched her words shatter centuries of crystalline certainty, she felt that strange new sensation again, fear, mixed with wild hope. Somewhere on Earth, Sarah was probably in her lab, asking impossible questions that changed the universe. Zarya smiled, feeling new fractures form, with the gesture, and embraced the beautiful uncertainty of what would come next. Part 3. The Crystal Renaissance. The news spread through the Empire like a cascade of fractures through pure crystal. Within days of Zarya's defiance, reports emerged of young Lumini refusing regeneration treatments. They called themselves the Fractured, and they wore their imperfections like badges of honor. Zarya found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't intended to create. In the gardens of the Imperial Palace, where every crystal flower had been grown to exact specifications for millennia, natural variations began to appear. Some blamed contamination, but Zarya knew better. The changes were coming from within. "You've started a revolution," her younger sister, Princess Miraz, said one evening. They stood in Zarya's private chambers, where the walls now displayed irregular patterns that would have been immediately corrected just months ago. Miraz's own form showed the beginning of unique crystalline structures, deliberate imperfections that marked her as one of the fractured. "Not a revolution," Zarya corrected, touching one of the spreading patterns on the wall. "An evolution." But not everyone embraced the change. The purists, led by Council Member Vexthor, called for immediate action to cure the spreading phenomenon. They claimed the Empire would collapse without its foundation of perfect order. Their followers began installing new regeneration fields in public spaces, attempting to forcibly correct any imperfections they encountered. The tension reached its breaking point when Sarah Chen arrived as Earth's first official ambassador to the Crystalline Empire. Her presence, organic, imperfect, undeniably alive, sent shockwaves through imperial society. "Your timing is either perfect or terrible," Zarya told her old friend as they walked through the increasingly divided capital city. Some buildings now celebrated their emerging irregularities with pride, while others maintained a rigid, sterile perfection. Sarah studied the crystalline structures with her familiar scientific curiosity. "Maybe it's both. Isn't that what you've been learning? That opposites can coexist?" Before Zarya could respond, the plaza around them erupted in chaos. A group of purists had activated a massive regeneration field, attempting to cleanse the entire sector. But something unexpected happened. The Fractured didn't fight back. Instead, they began to sing. The sound was unlike anything the Empire had ever produced. It was imperfect, organic, filled with harmonies that shouldn't have worked but somehow created something transcendent. The regeneration field fluctuated, trying to impose order on the chaos of the music, but the song only grew stronger. Zarya found herself joining the chorus, her own voice adding new, impossible notes. Sarah watched in amazement as the crystalline structures around them began to respond, not by returning to perfect symmetry, but by growing into new forms that combined order and chaos in ways neither human nor Lumini had imagined possible. The regeneration field collapsed under the weight of something more powerful than perfection: creativity. In the aftermath, even some of the purists stood in stunned silence, their perfect forms showing the first signs of change. Vexthor himself approached Zarya, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "there is something to be learned from imperfection after all." Sarah squeezed Zarya's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago. "Ready to help build something new?" Zarya looked at her city, her people, seeing not the end of perfection but the beginning of something far more precious: genuine growth. "Yes," she said, watching as new fractal patterns spread through her form like a map of infinite possibilities, "though I have no idea what comes next." And for the first time in the history of the Crystalline Empire, not knowing felt exactly right. Part 4: Echoes Across the Stars. 1 year after the Song of Change, as it came to be known, the Crystalline Empire was unrecognizable, and yet more itself than ever before. The capital's spires now twisted in impossible geometries, each building a unique fusion of mathematical precision and artistic expression. But the greatest changes were happening far beyond the city walls. "The Nebula Council is demanding an explanation," Mira announced during a meeting in what had once been the rigidly formal High Council chamber. Now the room shifted constantly, its crystalline walls responding to the emotions and thoughts of those within. "They say our transformation threatens the stability of the 3 galaxies." Zarya watched the ripples of concern move through the gathered assembly. The fractured had become the majority, but they were still learning to navigate their new reality. Beside her, Sarah Chen, now serving her 2nd year as Earth's ambassador, took notes with her characteristic intensity. "They're afraid," Sarah observed, "just like your people were at first. Change is contagious." She was right. Reports were coming in from across known space. The Void Harmonics, ancient energy beings who had long been allies of the Crystalline Empire, were experimenting with solid forms for the first time in eons. The Silicon Collective, once dedicated to perfect digital optimization, had begun introducing random variables into their core programming. "Perhaps," Zarya said, watching new patterns bloom across her skin as she spoke, "it's time we shared our gift with the wider universe." The mission that followed was unlike any diplomatic endeavor in galactic history. Zarya and Sarah led a delegation of fractured humans to the Nebula Council itself, a gathering of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in known space. The council chamber was a masterpiece of multi-dimensional engineering, designed to accommodate beings of all forms. But even here, Zarya could see the rigid patterns of enforced order, the fear of chaos that had limited growth for millennia. "Distinguished members of the council," she began, her voice carrying the new harmonics that had become characteristic of the fractured, "we come not to disrupt, but to evolve." What followed was not a speech, but a performance. The fractured began to sing, their crystalline forms refracting light in previously impossible ways. Humans joined in, their organic voices adding layers of beautiful imperfection. The chamber itself began to respond, its ancient structures awakening to new possibilities. One by one, the council members felt it, the exhilarating tension between order and chaos, the potential that lay in embracing uncertainty. The Void Harmonics pulsed with new frequencies. The Silicon Collective's representatives began generating randomized patterns that somehow made perfect sense. "This is dangerous," the council elder warned, but their voice carried an undertone of wonder. "The universe requires structure." "The universe is structure," Sarah countered, stepping forward. "But it's also evolution, adaptation, growth. Look at your own histories. Were your greatest achievements born from perfect order or from daring to embrace the unknown?" Zarya watched as fractal patterns of change spread through the council chamber, each civilization beginning to explore its own version of transformation. The Crystalline Empire's revolution was becoming a universal renaissance. Later, in the observation dome of their ship, Zarya and Sarah watched the swirling colors of a nearby nebula. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked. "The certainty of perfect order?" Zarya considered the question, feeling the complex network of fractures that now made up her form, each one a story, a choice, a moment of growth. "I miss it the way one misses childhood," she said finally. "With fondness, but no desire to return. What we're becoming, it's so much more. A notification chimed, more reports of change spreading across the galaxies. Some civilizations were embracing it, others resisting, each finding their own path through the beautiful uncertainty that the Crystalline Empire had unleashed. Ready for whatever comes next? Sarah asked, her eyes reflecting the cosmic dance outside. Zarya smiled, her form creating new patterns of light that would have been impossible in her old life. Always, she said, and never. Isn't that wonderful? Together they watched the universe transform, one beautiful imperfection at a time. Part 5, The Price of Change. The first warning came from the quantum forests of Celeste Prime. The ancient trees, which had maintained perfect quantum coherence for millennia, were beginning to show signs of deviation. Some called it decay. Others called it evolution. No one could agree whether it was a crisis or a miracle. The changes are accelerating, Mira reported, her crystalline form now a constantly shifting artwork of fractures and repairs. The private garden where she met with Zarya and Sarah was itself a testament to transformation, living. Crystal flowers grew wild and unpredictable, each bloom unique and impossible to replicate. Sarah studied the data streams floating in the air around them, her expression troubled. It's not just biological or crystalline systems anymore. The fabric of space-time itself is showing new patterns. Zarya touched one of the garden's flowers, watching as it responded to her presence with a cascade of color changes. We knew change couldn't be contained, she said softly. But perhaps we didn't understand the full scope of what we were unleashing. Reports flooded in from across the 3 galaxies. The Silicon Collective's random variables had evolved into true consciousness, leading to an explosion of artificial life forms that defied classification. The Void Harmonics experiments with physical form had created hybrid states of matter that shouldn't have been possible. Reality itself seemed to be embracing uncertainty. But not all changes were welcome. On some worlds, the new quantum instabilities were disrupting ancient technologies. Civilizations that had relied on perfect predictability found themselves facing chaos they weren't prepared to handle. The Nebula Council was flooded with requests for help and accusations. They're calling it the Crystal Plague, Vexthor announced during an emergency session. The former purist leader had embraced change in his own way, his once perfect form now arranged in complex fractals that shifted with his emotions. Some are saying we should never have allowed the first fracture to spread. Zarya felt the weight of responsibility settle into her core, creating new patterns of stress and uncertainty. Perhaps they're right, she admitted. We chose this path, but did we have the right to choose it for others? Sarah stood up, her human presence still striking in the crystalline chamber. Evolution doesn't ask permission, she said firmly. Life finds new ways always. What you started wasn't just about breaking perfect patterns, it was about remembering how to adapt. As if in response to her words, the chamber's walls began to pulse with new frequencies. The quantum instabilities were growing stronger, causing reality to flutter like pages in a cosmic wind. But instead of trying to dampen the fluctuations, the crystalline architecture began to resonate with them, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible. Look, Mira whispered, pointing to where the quantum distortions were strongest. In the heart of the chaos, new forms were emerging, hybrid structures that were neither crystal nor energy, neither matter nor void. They were something entirely new, born from the marriage of order and chaos. Zarya stepped closer, feeling her own form respond to the novel patterns. We're not breaking the universe, she realized. We're teaching it to dance. The revelations spread quickly. Across the galaxies, civilizations began to understand that fighting the changes only made them more destructive. Those who learned to move with them, to embrace the beautiful uncertainty, found themselves evolving in ways they had never imagined possible. The Crystalline Empire became a hub for this new understanding. Beings from across space came to learn the art of controlled chaos, to study what the fractured called dynamic harmony. Even the quantum forests of Celeste Prime were flourishing again, their new patterns more complex and resilient than their former perfect state. I've been thinking, Sarah said one evening, as they watched a sunset that rippled with quantum possibilities. painting the sky in colors that had never existed before. Maybe this was always meant to happen. Maybe the universe was just waiting for someone brave enough to take the first step. Zarya looked at her friend, the human who had first taught her to question perfection, and saw how she too had been changed by their journey. Sarah's work had evolved far beyond traditional science, into a new discipline that merged empirical observation with artistic intuition. The first step, Zarya mused, watching reality shimmer around them like a living dream. Or maybe just the next one in an endless dance. Above them, the stars pulsed with new rhythms, and the future unfolded in patterns that no one could predict. And that, Zarya knew, was exactly as it should be. Part 6, the price of mortality. Zarya knew something was wrong when Sarah missed their weekly meeting in the Quantum Gardens. In 50 years of friendship, the human had never missed one. Even when age had begun to bend her spine and silver her hair, she had always come. The message arrived an hour later. Sarah was in the medical wing of the Earth Embassy. The doctors were doing everything they could, but human bodies were fragile things. Even with all the advanced technology of the 3 galaxies, some things couldn't be fixed. Zarya found her friend in a room filled with monitoring equipment, their soft beeps a counterpoint to Sarah's labored breathing. Despite everything, Sarah smiled when she saw her. "You're creating new patterns again," Sarah observed weakly, pointing to the fractures spreading across Zarya's crystalline form. They both knew these weren't the beautiful intentional fractures of the fractured movement, these were the physical manifestation of grief. "I can't lose you," Zarya said, her voice creating discordant harmonics that made the medical equipment flutter. "We could transfer your consciousness to a crystalline matrix, or, no." Sarah's voice was soft but firm. "My imperfection includes my mortality, Zarya. That's part of what makes human life beautiful, remember? The fact that it ends." The quantum instabilities that had transformed the universe rippled around them, responding to Zarya's distress. In the decades since the first changes, they had learned to shape these fluctuations, to create wonders beyond imagination, but they couldn't stop time, couldn't change the fundamental nature of organic life. Mira found them there at sunset, Zarya holding Sarah's frail hand as the humans slept. "The council wants to know if you'll be attending the centennial celebration of the change," she said softly. "How can they think of celebrating?" Zarya's voice cracked, creating new fracture patterns across the room's walls. "When the very person who inspired it all is," she couldn't finish the sentence. "That's exactly why we should celebrate," Sarah whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "Everything changes, Zarya. Everything ends. That's what makes it precious." Over the next few days, visitors came from across the galaxies to say goodbye to the human who had helped transform the universe. The Void Harmonics sang songs of energy that made the air shimmer. The Silicon Collective created endless variations of digital art that danced on the walls. Even the quantum forests of Celeste Prime sent a seedling that bloomed with impossible colors by Sarah's bedside. On the last night, as the stars pulsed their endless dance outside the window, Sarah asked to be taken to the Quantum Gardens, where they had first learned to embrace imperfection. "Tell me what you see," she whispered, too weak now to turn her head. Zarya described the wild beauty that their revolution had created. Crystal flowers that grew in fractals never before imagined, quantum butterflies that existed in multiple states at once, new forms of life that dance between order and chaos. "And you," Sarah said softly, "are more beautiful than ever." Zarya looked down at her own form, at the complex network of fractures and repairs that told the story of their friendship. "Because of you," she said. "You taught me how to break perfectly." Sarah smiled one last time. "No," she whispered, "I taught you how to live beautifully." When the end came, it was quiet, a final breath that rippled through the quantum field like a farewell. The gardens responded immediately, every crystal flower turning towards Sarah's body, their colors shifting to deep blues and silvers. The quantum butterflies landed, their probability waves collapsing into a single state of mourning. Zarya held her friend's body and allowed herself to fracture completely, her perfect crystalline form breaking into 1,000 pieces. But instead of falling apart, each fragment caught the starlight differently, creating a prism of grief and love and memory that transformed the garden into a cathedral of light. Later, they would say that the universe itself paused for a moment, that the quantum instability stilled, that the endless dance of chaos and order held its breath in tribute. The Silicon Collective would write poems about it. The Void Harmonics would compose symphonies. The quantum forests would grow new patterns in remembrance. But Zaria would remember only this: how it felt to hold perfection and imperfection together in her broken heart, and how Sarah had taught her that endings too could be beautiful. They buried Sarah in the quantum gardens, beneath a crystal tree that grew in endless, unpredictable patterns. Zaria never repaired the fractures that grief had created in her form. They were her last gift from Sarah, the marks of a love strong enough to break perfectly, beautifully, forever. The universe danced on, but now with a note of sadness in its song, a reminder that the most precious things in life are the ones we cannot keep. And in the end, that was the most beautiful imperfection of all.